Hi, everybody. I am sitting here with Mr. Amirali Batada. He is the co-founder of the Global Partnership for Youth in Development. And so we're just going to get in conversation with him and go, delve into the old genesis of how the Youth in Development, Global Partnership for Youth in Development started. And, how did this initiative start?
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
So the partnership itself came out of a series of activities that unfolded about a year and a half ago, primarily coming from our clients, a demand that was stemming from all 6 of our regions across globally where the World Bank operates. And we started seeing some patterns unfolding, and that was really around the challenges this segment was encountering, the youth segment.
Yeah.
It came back to issues around jobs, around social inclusion, voice, directions in terms of the pathways young people are choosing and how they're choosing those pathways. And so what that warranted was a response that was more coordinated at the bank, and it required us to bring a lot of our different stakeholders together, both stakeholders and the thematic areas by which we work in, to come together and provide a response to this challenge. A secondary factor that was equally prominent last year, and it made a lot of the headlines, was when the issues of jobs, social inclusion, health, education, all of those different components, when they were not working as we had hoped in many different contexts, when young people felt that the social contract was broken, when there was a lack of predictability between what young people do in terms of their education, the pathways they pursue, and when they do graduate, or when they do come out of these transitions, and there is an opportunity for them, when they don't feel that their voices are being heard, we began to see a backlash. And there were figures in society, there were other players that exploited those vulnerabilities and those grievances that young people had faced. And we saw that erupting a lot last year in the form of radicalization, extremism in many different countries. So this was really a response to that. How do we bring all of these different dimensions around the issues that affect youth, from health, education, jobs, and technology, down to migration, violence, social inclusion, all of those elements. How do we bring them together across multiple regions who are encountering those challenges, and then develop a coordinated strategy on responding? And that's where the partnership, the Global Partnership for Youth and Development, came about.
Wow. So, who are the other individuals behind this initiative?
So we have a diverse team. It's a number of different individuals within the leadership, learning, and innovation practice. Okay. My counterpart is an individual by the name of Matthias Lundberg, and he and I, together with a larger team, have been able to start putting a lot of this work together, but really leveraging the expertise of many different players across the bank. Again, across those thematic areas and those regions who have a deep sense of concern about this issue, who have been working on this issue for a number of years, who bring a lot of knowledge around the different challenges youth are facing across those thematic areas. And we've brought a lot of them together, and they're actually being, presenting here today. And so that's what is making this conference very enjoyable. I think a lot of the feedback I've seen from young people is that they're very happy with the diversity of those themes, and the depth of the discussions, the richness of those discussions, and then having a chance to have those discourses with people from many different regions. And seeing those shared, those common challenges and those responses as well.
Yeah. I must say, I am really impressed with the way the forum is going. I see a lot of diverse faces, and on your agenda for the whole forum, the 3 days, it seems to touch on a lot of issues, So, and I also spoke with Mr. Lundberg, so that was a great conversation that we had as well. I'm curious as to you personally, what's your background, and how do you contribute in this?
Sure. Okay. So professionally, I wouldn't say I'm the typical individual that falls in a youth category or working on this issue, and I think that's what one of the reasons we've actually had some good discourses. Myself and Matthias, he has a traditional background in this area, and then I sort of bring the dimension I'm bringing to the table is a background of over nearly 15 years in the private sector, working quite closely with youth development from the lens of the private sector. In consulting for a number of years, in management consulting. Yeah. And then I took a few years off, and I began to spend time in understanding the different challenges young people were facing, but bringing the dimension of purpose, identity, understanding the role culture plays in the formation of those identities. So you have the technical elements that we want to focus on, education, health, economics, but then also understanding those early life experiences and how they shape the perspectives and the mindsets that young people then move onto. And then the interplay between those two is where I find my own personal interest lies. And so when Matthias and I brought those two things together, this is where we began to see where there were opportunities to, and I can give you some examples of that. So let's say in tomorrow's discussion, we're going to be talking about technology. And what I love about technology is it's a cross-cutting area. And so when you're looking at today's sessions around climate change, on jobs, right, we're having a chance to sort of look at the innovations that are unfolding in the space. Where should we be focusing our resources and time? Where should, this is an opportunity to bring young people in who are already providing those solutions, who are innovating in these spaces, and to actually learn from them. And saying, how can we take what you're doing right now, and you're doing it so successfully, despite the challenges that you're working in those contexts, how do we help you? How do we bring those resources to play? And how do we help scale up some of the solutions that you're putting forward? That's what we're trying to do here. So I think if you look at the forum itself, the two things that Matthias and I were hoping that people would take away was, one is developing a deep understanding of the problems themselves on their own. So what are the health challenges? What are the jobs challenges? What are the trends? What are the trajectories in each of those areas? That's the first. The second part is, and tied to that component, is not only to understand the trends and trajectories, but understanding the interplay and the interdependencies between them. So if we're not doing health well, how will that impact jobs? How will that impact violence and migration? And vice versa. So we wanted to help understand that component first. The second is, we didn't want young people to come away and say, wow, these challenges are large, what are we going to do? We said we need to make sure we're bringing others in who are operating and who are being successful in these places and saying, now tell us, how did you do it? And so, for example, again, I'm quoting some of my speakers tomorrow. We have an individual by the name of Marwa Moaz, who's the managing director for Al Mashura. It is the equivalent, she produced, her team and her produced a show that was the equivalent of the show called The Apprentice in the US. It was very successful, about 10 years ago when it first started, or 10 or 12 years ago. And it became the number 3 or 4 show in Egypt. And because of its success, it went now right across MENA. They've sold the rights to go out to MENA. But that's an example of how a television reality show that's trying to change the mindsets of young people in Egypt to look at opportunities beyond the public sector and start saying, what is entrepreneurship? How can we do it? Get them to get inspired, look at the different opportunities, the different pathways. This was something that her and her team put together, and it's been a huge success. To the point, I think some of the metrics that she uses, she mentioned to me, was I think they had the largest entrepreneurship network in MENA signed up on Facebook. So they had over 1 million followers. Wow. So that's quite promising, and it's nice to see that. Yeah.
I mean, it's really nice to hear a success story, and I'm glad I didn't have to ask you what's one success story, and that is here today. But all of the speakers are successful in their own rights, and they are young people. Most of them?
I would say majority.
Majority of them?
How we class or are identifying youth for this conference, we were looking at anywhere from 15 to 35 in that range, because you have some incredible young talents that are in that range of 15 to 20 that are been inspired much earlier, and then of course the majority that I've seen really begin to find themselves, whether it's pursuing secondary education, encountering some challenges shortly after they graduate, and realizing that maybe they need to take a different path, but they become, take on their own sort of identities around that mark, around 20, 25, all the way up to 35. And so by the time they get to close to 40, if they've taken this path, they become inspiring role models for many of the younger folks that are out here today.
So from my conversations with some of the participants, I'm like, what's your connection here? Why, a lot of them say networking. Networking is one major thing they're looking to get out of this. What do you think networking would do for some of these people? And also in terms of action point from here. So, this is not your first rodeo at events like this that brings people from all over the world together, and the conversation ends there. One of the reasons why I'm actually doing this, regardless of the challenges I faced in trying to put this together, is I don't want this to just end here. I want this to be a conversation that drives the momentum with young people, and just to keep the conversation going. So what are some action points, and then what the first, the networking, and then also what's the action points that you can see from here?
Okay. I think there's two that come to mind immediately.
Okay.
One is, I think the networking itself is playing a very there's a role of mentorship I see happening here.
Yeah.
I see a sense of inspiration. Okay, from the conversations I've seen at the tables, I see young people or others who work in different contexts and are asking others who have been very successful or have tried things out or have failed but have course corrected along the way, and I think they're learning a lot. And I think they're being inspired and are almost gaining new mentors from halfway across the world. So that's the first point I'm beginning to see. The second, I would say, is the idea where when there's new solutions that are being introduced. So I think there was an example, like I shared with you right now, about Egypt. There's a young woman from Botswana who ran one of the most successful Twitter campaigns using the hashtag "If Africa Were a Bar," and seeing her examples and her work, and that encounter with other folks from, let's say, Latin America, from the Far East, from other parts of Europe and the US, it's that cross-sharing or the exchange of knowledge. Right. I had so for example, I often use this where, Uber was very successful and then it went global. But there were many other Ubers that had either started just before or started during. I would say not many, but say several. Yeah. Whether it's in India, there's Ola. In Southeast Asia, there's Grab Taxi. In the Middle East, there's another one that's big. So all of these models get either replicated, they get sort of contextualized for a local market. And I think there's going to be a lot of that inspiration that's going to happen. That's a for-profit model. Now, can you imagine if we actually had many of these social enterprises that were started in many different places, whether it's around electricity, water, health, education, and they were replicated and even scaled up? In other words, this is where I see success happening. Yeah.
And so definitely like a communion like this, bringing people together, exchange of ideas happens, and people are able to learn from each other, replicate, each other's, ideas in their own way to go forth with it.
Exactly it.
Yeah. So with diversity, culture, and I'm asking this question because I'm going to give credit to the person who originally asked me this question in one of my earlier interviews with Ahmed Al-Endawi, who's going to be here on Wednesday. Right. I was happy to interview him last week at the UN. And some of the questions that I received from other young people for him was, where does culture play a role in the Sustainable Development Goal? And so I think, for some reason, I feel like I should ask you that question. I feel like you might have an answer for that. I didn't get to ask him, and it was Zito Umboa that asked me that question. I have to give him credit for that question. But where does culture play a role in all of this?
It's an excellent question. Yeah. I think it's an area that needs to be explored even further. My personal interest as it relates to culture is around behavioral change, around mindset change. I think it's very important for when it comes to development. I think this came up a number of times in the sessions where, this notion, if you build the schools, if you provide infrastructure, if you offer a lot of these different services, whether it's in health, education, whichever category you're looking at, the turn-up is not always as strong as one would hope, okay? There's often sometimes perceptions about the service itself, how it's being delivered, what it entails, who's providing it. Is it a trusted source? Is it not? And so when you think about all of these intervention strategies and look at it from a lens of culture, from social norms, even understanding politics as well, that ties into all of that. If you look at culture sort of more broadly, then I think what it does is gives you an opportunity to sort of take a step back and say, what works? When are people inspired? When are campaigns most successful? And if you can study the science behind that, around mindset shift, behavioral change, and see that there's key influencers. And I can use one example that I actually find to be somewhat very apt based on what some of the work that we're doing right now. There was a survey that was done I came across that said that, let's say within the Muslim community, as an example, in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, that the imams, and let's just say more broadly, whether it's churches, mosques, the religious figurehead is, or the religious leader within these institutions, has one of the highest levels of trust amongst young people. Okay? They trust religious leaders more. I think they were either number one or number two in the survey I had seen. And I thought that was very powerful. Now imagine if you could get a religious leader or on board to start talking about entrepreneurship, to start talking about access to clean energy. It is a domain that one would think that is not traditional to the spiritual realm. But as we understand the relationship between development and culture, it becomes an obvious sort of intervention or an obvious request where we would bring these folks on board. We would, and I think it ties back to how many traditions, spiritual faiths actually look at life and look at the role of, the Pope itself right now has been playing a very dominant role in here, right? Recognizing the, closing the gap in poverty, bringing social issues to surface, talking about the environment. And if we had more individuals within the spiritual realm talking about that, the interplay between between development and spirituality, I think we could see development accelerating very quickly.
That is so profound. I mean, yeah, because you don't get to look at things that way. That's an out of the box thinking. And I guess that's why you are where you are, and those are the kind of out of the box thinking that is required. And when you think about culture, that's culture, your religion, your background, and that's all culture, and so it does play a role, but you feel like it's undermined greatly. It's not as
I think we have an opportunity right now. Okay. I think it's more prominent than it's ever been, where religious leaders have a role now to play. No, they've always had a role, they have been. But how we engage them actively, our ability to recognize whether it's in project designs, whether it's in implementation, whether we're doing early assessments, whatever it may be, but the ability to ensure that we're capturing their voice. We're actively engaging them throughout the process. I think that will be critical. And our programs will be successful for it. I guess the questions, but then we also have to recognize that we're going to be dealing with very complex subjects. And so when we are straddling between the secular and the spiritual realms, when it comes to development, we'll have to think about it. We'll have to think carefully about how that should be thought about in terms of the sequencing, what types of interventions we should start with, and we should build upon some early successes. And once the communities, once the development sector, once different stakeholders, including government, begin to understand that there's an important area here that we could leverage and that does provide the fruits that we're looking for, then I think we can build on it. So it involves a little bit of prototyping, some piloting, and I think we learn, as they say in entrepreneurship and in innovation, that we learn from our mistakes quickly. We take calculated risks, and I think we should be able to move forward from there.
So we are going to wrap up shortly, but I guess my final question for you is, who do we bring at the table now? So who because it seems like there's got to be this exchange of ideas and this dialogue, and that's what creates the momentum. So who are the stakeholders right now that you think should be at the table?
So I think let's start with youth themselves, specifically, right? This is a session that's bringing many different youth together, in addition to many other stakeholders that are represented here. We have government, private sector, foundations, the bank, right? International institutions. We have many different representatives here. But I think if we can figure out how to take more young leaders, that, as you pointed out, right, so rightly, around social entrepreneurs, those who have young individuals who are parliamentarians, getting their voices and their perspectives heard at the table. So it's not, and bringing them to the discussion not only around youth issues, it's particularly around, let's say, we have an energy crisis, we have a health issue. So we're going to bring all the different players together, but we'd love to have youth sitting at that table, understanding their perspectives right now, particularly because there's they bring an understanding of what is happening on the ground. They understand the role that technology is playing. They understand the challenges that each of them have encountered that's served as a barrier and how they've gone around those channels. And if we can figure out how, their successes and getting those successes shared to the wider public, then I think we have an opportunity to change the discussion in a different way, where we may take a step back and say, okay, well, how do we finance more of these social entrepreneurs? Yeah. We talked about this new mechanism for financing, for growth, for young entrepreneurs and social entrepreneurs. How do we make that more accessible in many different places?
Real quick, 2 opportunities that young people watching can access right now. Can you tell us 2?
2 opportunities that they should be looking out for. Yeah. Okay. I think I would say one is think about the networks that are being formed right now all around you. Okay. And I would say networks that are beyond your community, beyond your city, beyond your country. Okay, there's a lot of, I think because of the net, because the way, and I'm going to bring my perspective on innovation specifically, because when we're talking about development and we're talking about identifying solutions, I'm going to tell young people to look at all the different global networks that are happening right now through Facebook, through other channels, where there's institutions in the U.S. right now that are trying to move globally, right? So whether it's Silicon Valley that wishes to invest now in many different countries and many different regions of the world, which is different than how they're looking for outlets and local players that are willing to partner with them. And I think if they keep their eyes on that, they'll have huge opportunities for ideation, understanding how problems are being solved in other parts of the world, and the clear step-by-step pathways on what they can pursue.
Okay. Second.
And the second part, I would say, one of the most important elements, I think, is going to be for young people, for everyone in the future, and that's education, and that's knowledge. Obtaining access to the most relevant, cutting-edge knowledge will be critical. Find that knowledge. It's out there. And it's going to take a little bit of digging at times. So you have the networks that we had just talked about, which is going to be very important. That may help you get access to that knowledge, to access to those resources, the financing. But the knowledge itself is something they'll have to seek out. And that means, as an example, if you are a young social entrepreneur recognizing, let's say let's say it's not your city, but it's in a tier 2 city or a village, for that matter, and you recognize that solar technology is dropping in price, right? It's more affordable. How do I get my hands on that? That's one. How do I find the right suppliers? How do I identify or create or leverage existing business models that have been applied in other places? And so that type of knowledge is something they'll have to seek often. And they'll have to try to tap into what we often say is on the edge, right? At the edge of that knowledge. Yeah. And being able to differentiate between, who's actually offering something that's, maybe dated a few years back versus those that are providing it right now. And that'll be important for them, I think.
I could go on and on in conversation with you. Great insights and great out-of-the-box thinking, I must confess. But so we know that networks and education. Thank you for now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you so much for coming.
You're very welcome.